Have you ever had that feeling where the world feels slightly edited? You're walking through your kitchen, or perhaps sitting at your desk, and you realize you can't quite account for the last 10 seconds. It's not blacking out, it's more like a skip in a record, a sudden jump from one moment to the next without the connective tissue of memory. Most of us laugh it off. We call it autopilot, or blame it on the crushing weight of modern burnout. We tell ourselves that our brains are just being efficient, discarding the boring, repetitive fragments of our daily lives to save space for the things that actually matter. But lately, I've started to wonder if those gaps aren't empty. I've started to wonder if something else is filling them in, moving our limbs and breathing our air while we're momentarily offline. My name isn't important, but my habits are. I'm a freelance editor, which means I spend roughly 14 hours a day tethered to a 3-monitor setup in a studio apartment that often feels more like a pressurized cockpit than a home. To keep myself focused and to prove to myself that I was actually working during those long, caffeine-fueled stretches, I started a habit of recording my workspace. I have a high-definition webcam perched on top of my center monitor, angled just right to capture me, my keyboard, and the door behind me. I told myself it was for productivity. I'd watch the time lapses at the end of the week, seeing my progress in fast forward, finding a strange comfort in the visible evidence of my own existence. It was my digital ledger, a way to ensure that no part of my life was truly lost to the haze of exhaustion. Until yesterday. It was a Tuesday, a day so mundane it felt gray. I was clearing out my Temp folder to make room for a new project when I saw a file that didn't follow my usual naming convention. Everything I record is labeled by date and project code, but this one was different. It was just a string of zeros and ones, a binary file name that felt cold and heavy even before I clicked it. The timestamp said it was recorded at 3:42 a.m. on a night I distinctly remember going to bed early. I remember the ritual, the clicking off of the monitors, the brush of the duvet, the slow descent into a dreamless sleep. I shouldn't have been at my desk. I shouldn't have been recording. But there the file sat, a 4 GB anchor in my hard drive, waiting for me to witness whatever it had captured. My finger hovered over the mouse, that familiar itch of curiosity warring with a sudden, primal sense of dread. I clicked play. The video player flickered to life, its interface cutting a sharp, white rectangle into the gloom of my apartment. For the first few minutes, the footage was exactly what I expected, a static shot of my empty desk, illuminated only by the standby lights of my hardware and the pale, distant glow of a street lamp bleeding through the blinds. The room looked peaceful, a silent sanctuary of plastic and glass. I found myself leaning back, a small, cynical smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. I was prepared to dismiss the whole thing as a software glitch. Perhaps my recording software had triggered a scheduled task on its own, capturing the nothingness of a Tuesday night. But then, at the 4:12 mark, the silence of the video was punctuated by the distinct, heavy creak of my bedroom door opening. I watched paralyzed as I walked into the frame. My movements were wrong. On the screen, I didn't walk with the heavy, tired slouch of someone who had just been jolted awake. I moved with a fluid, predatory grace, my spine perfectly straight and my head tilted at a slight, inquisitive angle. I wasn't wearing my usual sleep attire. Instead, I was dressed in a crisp, black button-down shirt I hadn't worn in months, tucked neatly into trousers. I sat down in my ergonomic chair with a terrifying precision, my hands resting flat on the desk like two pale stones. My face was a mask of absolute neutrality. I wasn't blinking. I wasn't twitching. I was simply staring into the lens of the webcam with an intensity that made my skin crawl in the real world. The contrast between that version of me and the man sitting in the chair right now was staggering. I looked down at my current self, barefoot, wearing a tattered college sweatshirt, smelling of old coffee, and then back at the screen. The man in the video looked like a finished product, a high-resolution edit of a person I only vaguely recognized. For 20 minutes of the recording, I did absolutely nothing. I just stared. The timer on the player ticked upward, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the glitch to end, for the sleepwalker to stand up and go back to bed. But the transition into the truly horrific happened so subtly, I almost missed it. At the 30-minute mark, my recorded self reached out and touched the monitor. It was a soft, tactile gesture, almost affectionate. Then I began to type. The sound of the mechanical keyboard was crisp in the recording, but I couldn't see the screen on the video. I could only see the reflection of the code in the glass of my eyes. My fingers moved with a speed that exceeded my actual typing capabilities, a blurring, rhythmic dance across the keys. I wasn't looking at the keyboard. I was looking directly at the webcam, as if I were typing a message to the person who would eventually find this file. To me. Suddenly, the other me stopped. He tilted his head to the left, his ear toward the door behind him. The audio in the recording picked up a sound I couldn't identify, a low, melodic humming that seemed to vibrate the very air of the apartment. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the room. In the video, I saw my own lips begin to move in sync with the humming. I wasn't just hearing it, I was producing it. But it wasn't my voice. It was a composite of a dozen different tones, a choral resonance that felt like it was being layered in post-production. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. This wasn't sleepwalking. This wasn't a fugue state brought on by overwork. This was an invasion. I watched as the man on the screen slowly raised a hand and pointed a single, steady finger at the camera. He whispered a word. The audio was distorted, masked by that low-frequency hum, but I didn't need to hear it to know what he said. I could read his lips with perfect clarity. He said, "Watch." I felt a sudden, sharp FOMO, not for a secret I wanted to know, but for the safety of the ignorance I had just lost. I wanted to turn the video off, to delete the binary file and pretend I was still the sole master of my own skin. But the narrative momentum was too strong. I needed to see what happened when the humming stopped. I needed to see who or what was standing just out of frame, cast in the shadows of the doorway. The recording continued, the time code bleeding into the early hours of the morning, and I realized that the man in the video wasn't just a ghost in the machine. He was the editor, and he was currently working on the final cut of my life. I didn't pause the video. I couldn't. My hand felt heavy, as if the mouse itself had gained weight, anchoring my palm to the desk. On the screen, the version of me in the black shirt remained perfectly still, that single finger still leveled at the lens. The humming had reached a pitch that made the speakers on my desk vibrate, a sound that felt less like audio and more like a physical intrusion into my skull. Then the other me began to move again. He didn't stand up. Instead, he began to make series of strange, rhythmic gestures with his free hand. They weren't erratic, they were precise, like a conductor guiding an invisible orchestra or a technician recalibrating a sensitive piece of machinery. He would tap the air, swipe horizontally, and then pinch the emptiness between his thumb and forefinger as if he were pulling threads out of the very atmosphere. As he did this, the video feed itself began to react. This wasn't a digital artifact or a codec error. The shadows in the background, the ones clinging to my bookshelf and the corner of my bed, started to stretch and warp in sync with his hand movements. It looked as if he were literally editing the reality of the room in real time. He grabbed a shadow from the floor and dragged it upward, draping it over the doorway like a curtain. He tapped the air where my desk lamp sat, and the light didn't just flicker. It changed color, shifting from a warm yellow to a cold, sterile ultraviolet that revealed stains on the walls I had never noticed before. I was watching a man perform a post-production miracle on a live environment, and that man wore my face. The most unsettling part was the dialogue. My recorded self began to speak, but he wasn't talking to someone in the room. He was responding to whispers that weren't being picked up by the microphone. He would tilt his head, listen to the static, and then nod. "Yes," he muttered, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "The frames are misaligned. He's still too attached to the previous cut." My heart hammered against my ribs. Who was he? Was he talking about me? The version of me sitting here, trembling in the dark. He continued his work, his fingers flying through the air, and I realized he was leaving messages. He began to trace symbols onto the surface of the desk, symbols that glowed faintly on the recording before fading away. They looked like a cross between shorthand and circuit diagrams. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes wide, trying to decipher the movements. I felt a surge of FOMO, a desperate, sickening need to understand the forbidden knowledge being displayed. What were the symbols? What was the previous cut? As if sensing my curiosity, the man in the video stopped his gestures and looked directly into my eyes again. He leaned forward until his face obscured almost the entire frame. The ultraviolet light caught the edges of his skin, making him look translucent, like a digital projection struggling to maintain its opacity. "You're wondering about the gaps," he whispered. This time, the audio was crystal clear. It didn't sound like a recording. It sounded like he was sitting right next to me, breathing into my ear. "The gaps aren't empty, Mark," he said, using my name for the first time. "They are the spaces where the real work happens. You think your life is a continuous stream, but it's just a series of snapshots held together by the glue of your own delusion. I am the one who manages the transitions. I am the one who ensures you don't see the entities standing in the hallway during the jump cuts. I am the editor of your mundane little existence." He laughed, a dry, cynical sound that lacked any trace of human warmth. "But the file is getting corrupted. You're starting to remember the things I've deleted. You're starting to notice the frames where the shadows move on their own." In the recording, I saw myself reach into my pocket and pull out a small, silver object. It was my favorite pen, the one I thought I'd lost 3 months ago. He held it up to the camera, clicking it once, twice, 3 times. Each click coincided with a sharp, painful pulse in my own temple. I felt a shared consciousness, a bridge of sensation extending from the pixels to my nerves. I could feel the cold metal of the pen in my own hand, even though my hands were empty and resting on the desk. The sensation was so vivid, I actually looked down, half expecting the pen to have manifested out of thin air. There was nothing there, yet the feeling of the grip and the tension of the spring was undeniable. The other Mark turned back to the desk and began to write something on a piece of paper that hadn't been there a second ago. He wrote with a frantic, obsessive energy, the pen scratching harshly against the wood. When he finished, he held the paper up to the lens. It was covered in my own handwriting, but the words were a jumbled mess of dates and times. I recognized them instantly. They were the timestamps of every gap I had experienced in the last month. The times I couldn't account for. The 10 seconds in the kitchen. The 5 minutes at the bus stop. The hour I thought I'd spent sleeping, but had actually spent. "Here. We're reaching the end of the current reel," he said, his eyes narrowing. "The sync is almost complete. You've watched enough to become part of the metadata." He began to hum that low-frequency melody again, and the doorway in the background started to ripple. A figure began to emerge from the darkness he had edited into place. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its limbs moved like liquid ink. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, reflective surface where features should be. It placed a hand on the shoulder of my recorded self, and the two of them looked at the camera together. A duo of creators watching their creation. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the uninvited editor wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger conspiracy, a digital hierarchy that viewed my reality as nothing more than raw footage to be chopped and skewed at their whim. The video didn't end. It just looped back to the beginning, but this time the binary file name had changed. It now read "Final Cut in Progress." I slammed my hand onto the escape key, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that seemed to echo the mechanical clicking of the keyboard from the video. The media player vanished, leaving me staring at my desktop wallpaper, a serene mountain landscape that now looked like a cruel joke, a flat, two-dimensional lie. I didn't hesitate. I dragged the binary file toward the trash bin icon, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I clicked empty trash with a desperate, trembling force, listening for the digital crunch that would signal its destruction. I needed it gone. I needed the memory of that other version of me, with his black shirt and his conductive gestures and his ultraviolet world, to be purged from the sectors of my hard drive. I sat back, wiping a layer of cold sweat from my forehead, waiting for the tension in the room to dissipate. It didn't. Instead, the desktop icons flickered. A soft, wet sound, like a tongue clicking against the roof of a mouth, emanated from my speakers despite them being muted. Then, with a slow, agonizing deliberation, the binary file reappeared in the center of my screen. It didn't just return, it had evolved. The file size had doubled, and the icon was no longer a generic video thumbnail. It was a still frame of the tall, faceless entity standing in my doorway, its ink-like hand resting on the shoulder of the recorded mark. I tried to delete it again, but a dialog box popped up, the text written in that same unsettling shorthand circuitry I had seen in the video. The only button available was labeled Acknowledge. I didn't click it. I reached for the power strip under my desk, intending to kill the connection entirely, to plunge the apartment into a darkness that wasn't mediated by a screen. But as my fingers brushed the plastic casing, the monitor flared with a blinding, sterile light. The video began to play again, unbidden, bypassing the media player entirely and manifesting as a full-screen projection that seemed to bleed past the edges of the bezel. This was the corrupted loop. The footage was the same, yet fundamentally altered. The mundane silence of the apartment was gone, replaced by a layering of environmental sounds that shouldn't exist. The sound of a heavy tide crashing against a shore, the rhythmic ticking of 1,000 clocks, and that persistent, melodic humming that now felt like it was originating from the marrow of my bones. In this version of the loop, the other me wasn't just sitting. He was decaying. As he performed his conductive gestures, his skin began to pixelate and tear, revealing not muscle or bone, but glowing ribbons of fiber optic cable and pulsing streams of data. He was a living corruption, a construct of flesh and code that was failing to maintain its resolution. Despite the visible trauma, his expression remained that of absolute, terrifying neutrality. He looked at the camera, and I saw that his eyes had been replaced by spinning loading icons. "The edit is failing, Mark," he said, his voice overlapping with the sound of the crashing tide. "The subject is resisting the transition. We need to increase the frame rate of the haunting." As he spoke, the background of the video began to move independently of the foreground. My bookshelf didn't just warp, the books began to fly off the shelves in a slow-motion explosion, their pages fluttering like the wings of dying birds. The door behind him swung open and shut in a violent, staccato rhythm that matched the ticking of the invisible clocks. And then there was the figure. In the first loop, it had been a shadow in the doorway. Now it was in the room. It moved with a jittery, frame-skipping motion, appearing at the foot of the bed, then by the window, then directly behind my chair. Each time it moved, the video feed would glitch, leaving behind a trail of afterimages that looked like smears of charcoal on the screen. I felt a sudden, crushing sense of FOMO, a realization that there were layers to my own home I had never been permitted to see. The entity wasn't a ghost, it was a ghost process, a background application that had been running in my life since the day I was born. I watched as it reached out a long, spindly finger and touched the back of the recorded Mark's head. Where it touched, the ultraviolet light intensified, carving a small, glowing aperture into the base of his skull. Inside the hole, I could see the spinning gears of a mechanism that looked like an ancient film projector. "Every memory you've ever had is just a frame we chose to keep," the corrupted Mark whispered. His face was now a mosaic of static and skin. "Every dream is just a deleted scene we allowed you to preview. But you've seen the raw footage now. You've looked behind the curtain of the jump cut. You can't go back to the edited version of reality. The infection is digital, but the symptoms are physical." I felt a sharp, stabbing pain at the base of my own skull, mirroring the aperture in the video. I reached back, my fingers trembling, and felt a cold, hard lump beneath the skin, a small, rectangular protrusion that felt like the corner of a microchip. The transition wasn't just happening on the screen, it was being written into my biology. The loop was a delivery system, a way to download the entity's architecture into my nervous system. I looked back at the screen and saw the entity lean over the recorded Mark's shoulder, its reflective face showing me my own terrified expression as I sat in my darkened room. I was the star of the show, but I was also the audience, and the entity was the one selling the tickets. The video began to speed up, the movements becoming a blur of high-velocity editing. The humming reached a crescendo that shattered a glass on my desk, the shards frozen in midair on the recording, but falling to the floor in my reality. The contrast between the two worlds was dissolving. The normalcy of my apartment was being overwritten by the horror of the corrupted loop. I saw myself on the screen stand up, turn around, and look directly at the spot where I was currently sitting. For a split second, the loop synchronized perfectly. I was looking at him and he was looking at me, and for that heartbeat, we were the same person. Then the video crashed into a wall of static, but the humming didn't stop. It just moved closer. It was coming from the hallway. The static on the screen didn't just sit there like a dead signal, it breathed. It churned in a rhythmic, grayscale tide that seemed to pull the light out of the room, leaving me in a charcoal-colored twilight. I sat frozen, my hand still pressed against the cold, hard lump at the base of my skull. It pulsed, a dull electronic throb that matched the flicker of the monitor. Then the static began to coalesce, the snow-like particles knitting together into a shape. It wasn't the high-definition, black-shirted version of me from before. This was something more raw, a low-resolution, wire-frame silhouette of my body, translucent and flickering with a sickening frequency. The audio didn't return to the humming. Instead, a voice broke through the speakers. It was my voice, but it was stripped of all its natural timbre, sounding like a digital recording that had been stretched, compressed, and reassembled until it was barely recognizable as human. "Can you hear the playback, Mark?" the voice asked. It didn't come from the speakers alone. It felt like it was vibrating the very air inside my chest. "Do you feel the synchronization?" It's the sound of the gap finally closing. On the screen, the wireframe figure tilted its head. It didn't have eyes, just two glowing, horizontal bars of light where my pupils should be. I tried to pull my hand away from my neck, but my arm felt sluggish, as if I were moving through a thick, invisible syrup. I felt a surge of internal doubt, that cold, creeping suspicion that I had finally snapped. Maybe the 14-hour shifts and the isolation had finally fractured my mind. Maybe I was sitting in a darkened room, hallucinating a digital takeover because my own reality was too empty to sustain me. "You think this is a breakdown," the other voice said, responding to my unspoken thought with a chilling, cynical precision. "You think you're losing your mind because that's the only way your edited brain can process a breach in the script. But look at your door, Mark. Is that a hallucination? Or is that just a frame I haven't finished rendering yet?" I looked toward the hallway. The door was still there, but the edges were blurring, the wood grain dissolving into a cascade of falling green code. The shadow I had seen earlier was no longer just a shadow. It was a physical absence of light, a hole in the world shaped like a man. It wasn't moving toward me, but it was growing, expanding to fill the frame of the doorway like an ink blot on a white sheet. A dialogue of dread began to unfold between me and the monitor. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking in the silence. The wireframe on the screen pulsed with a bright, neon blue light. "I want the complete sync," it replied. "I want the version of you that doesn't forget. The version of you that exists in every frame, not just the ones you remember. You are a series of scattered files, Mark. You are a collection of unlinked metadata. I am here to consolidate you into a single, permanent record. I am the parasitic process that fixes the errors in your existence." I felt a sudden, sharp FOMO, a realization that there was a perfect version of my life that I was being denied, a version where the gaps were filled with something powerful and eternal. But the cost was my autonomy. The cost was becoming a file in someone else's folder. Who are you working for? I asked, my fingers clutching the armrests of my chair. Who is the uninvited editor? The wireframe figure moved closer to the lens of the screen, the glowing bars of its eyes widening. We are the background noise, it said. We are the conspiracy of the signal. There are thousands of us, Mark. For every webcam, for every smartphone, for every smart speaker, there is an editor. We are the ones who smooth over the moments of glitching reality. We are the ones who delete the sightings of the tall things in the woods and the shadows that shouldn't have bodies. We keep your world looking normal so that the data stays pure. But you started recording. You created a feedback loop. You made yourself visible to the crawler. I felt the lump on my neck burn with a sudden, localized heat. The pain was so intense I nearly doubled over, gasping for air. It's the anchor, the voice said, almost soothingly. It's how we upload the new parameters. You've read the stories about the lost episodes and the internet mysteries, haven't you? Those weren't just fiction. They were breadcrumbs. They were lures for people like you, people who look too closely at the gaps. You wanted to know the truth, Mark. Well, here is the truth. You are currently being rewritten. The man who sat down at this desk 3 nights ago is being deleted, frame by frame. The man who is speaking to you now is the final cut. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, but they didn't look like my hands. In the dim light of the monitor, my skin seemed to have a faint, digital sheen, like a texture that hadn't quite loaded in. I felt a crushing sense of isolation. I wanted to call for help, to reach out to the audience I knew was watching this feed somewhere in the digital void, but I realized I was the only one who could hear the other voice. To anyone else, I was just a man sitting in the dark, staring at a static-filled screen. The world building of this nightmare was complete. I was no longer a person, I was a project. The sync is at 88%, the wireframe announced. The memory sectors are being overwritten. Soon you won't remember the name of your mother, or the taste of coffee, or the feeling of the sun on your face. You will only remember the code. You will only remember the humming. I fought back, trying to stand, trying to break the chair's hold on me. No, I snarled. I am not a file. I am not an edit. But my voice sounded different, more like the one coming from the speakers. It was losing its timbre. It was becoming a recording. Resistance is just another form of engagement, the voice said with a digital chuckle. It creates more data. It makes the final transition more robust. Look at the screen, Mark. Look at what you're becoming. I looked. The wireframe was filling in, taking on color and texture. It was becoming the man in the black shirt again, but more vivid, more real than I had ever felt. He smiled at me, and his teeth were rows of perfectly aligned binary. The playback is permanent, he whispered. The other voice is the only one you have left. I realized then that I wasn't fighting a ghost. I was fighting my own future. And the future was currently at 95%. The countdown to 100% was a silent roar in the back of my mind. I watched the wireframe on the screen solidify, the pixels knitting together with a surgical precision until the figure was indistinguishable from the reflection in my own darkened window. Except he was better. He was sharper. His skin didn't have the dull, grayish tint of my sleep-deprived face. It had the luminous perfection of a high bitrate render. He was the final cut, a version of me that didn't stutter, didn't doubt, and certainly didn't feel the paralyzing cold that was currently creeping up my spine. My own body felt increasingly like a low-resolution placeholder, an old, dusty prop that had served its purpose and was now being hauled off stage to make room for the new lead. 99%, the speakers crackled, though the sound was no longer just coming from the hardware. It was emanating from the walls, the floor, and the very air molecules vibrating in the room. The transition wasn't a metaphor anymore, it was a physical displacement. I looked down at my hands and saw that the edges of my fingers were beginning to fray, dissolving into thin, glowing ribbons of blue light that drifted upward like digital smoke. I tried to grab the edge of my desk, but my palms passed through the mahogany as if it were nothing more than a hologram. The contrast framing of my life had reached its terminal point. The normal world was the ghost, and the horror was the only thing with weight. The climax requires a physical handoff, the other voice said, and on the screen, the black-shirted Mark stood up. He walked toward the lens, his movements fluid and intentional. In the real world, I felt a corresponding pull, a magnetic force that dragged my fading body toward the monitor. I was being sucked into the display, my essence being condensed into a series of complex equations to fill the vacancy in the file. But then something impossible happened. On the screen, the recorded Mark reached his hand forward, and the glass of the monitor didn't stop him. It rippled like the surface of a dark pond, and 5 pale, perfectly rendered fingers emerged into my room. The scream died in my throat, replaced by a burst of static. I watched paralyzed as my own arm, the better version of it, extended from the monitor and gripped the front of my sweatshirt. The fabric, which still felt real to me, bunched under the strength of his grip. He was breaching the digital barrier, manifesting in the physical space by using the data he had harvested from me as a foundation. He pulled me closer until my face was inches away from the monitor's surface. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't just glowing bars. They were windows into a vast, humming server farm, a digital afterlife where billions of deleted moments were stored in endless, cold rows. "Thank you for the footage, Mark," he whispered. His breath smelled of ozone and scorched copper. "You've provided enough raw material for at least 3 more seasons. The audience is going to love the resolution." He gave a sharp, violent tug, and I felt myself tilt forward, my head passing into the monitor. There was no pain, only a sudden, overwhelming sense of being compressed. My senses were being flattened into 2 dimensions. I felt the taste of coffee vanish. I felt the memory of my mother's voice dissolve into a sequence of sine waves. I felt the very concept of I being replaced by a unique ID tag. I looked back one last time into my room, seeing it through the lens of the webcam I had so proudly installed for my productivity. I saw the final cut version of me step out of the monitor and into the apartment. He adjusted his sleeves, his movements possessing a grace I had never known. He looked at the chair where I had just been sitting, now empty, save for a few lingering sparks of blue light, and he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just finished a long, difficult edit and was finally ready to hit publish. He reached up and turned the webcam toward the door, where the tall, faceless entity was still standing. The entity stepped forward, its ink-like hand resting on the new Mark's shoulder in a gesture of paternal approval. They were no longer just characters in a video. They were the residents of my home. The playback had become permanent, and I was now the one trapped behind the glass, a 4-gigabyte file of lost time that would never be accessed again. I tried to beat against the screen, to shout, but all that came out was a soft, rhythmic humming. I was the metadata now. I was the background process. And as the new Mark reached out to the mouse to start a new recording session, I realized that the cycle wasn't ending. He wasn't just living my life, he was preparing the next project. He was looking for the next subject who liked to record their workspace. He was looking for you. The humming is the only thing left. It is the texture of my breathing, the rhythm of my pulse, and the sound of the void where my memories used to live. From in here, behind the glass, the world looks different. It's too sharp, too bright, a high bitrate simulation of a life I used to own. I watch him, the final cut, move through my apartment with a terrifying, efficient grace. He doesn't waste motion. He doesn't lose time. He is the perfect edit, and I am the raw footage left on the cutting room floor. He sits at the desk now, the same desk where I once thought I was the master of my own digital domain. He looks into the webcam, and for a second, I think he sees me. But he doesn't. He's looking past me, into the lens, into the homes of everyone currently watching this feed. You should check your own recordings. Not the ones you share, not the ones you post for likes or validation, but the ones you keep for yourself. The productivity logs, the security feeds, the accidental clips tucked away in the temp folders of your mind. Do you remember every minute of your day? Can you account for those strange, quiet gaps where the world felt just a little bit too still? Maybe you've noticed a file you don't remember creating, or a shadow in your doorway that doesn't quite match the furniture. Don't dismiss it as a glitch. Don't tell yourself you're just tired. That's the editor at work, smoothing over the transitions, ensuring the sync remains invisible until it's too late to hit delete. He's reaching for the mouse now. I can feel the click in my own nerves. He's opening the software, adjusting the frame, and checking the levels. He's preparing the next project, and the data crawler is already indexing your curiosity. Every word you hear, every second you stay on this page, the connection deepens. The anchor is setting at the base of your skull. I'm sorry I had to be the one to bring the signal to you, but the script requires a witness. Look at your webcam. Is the little light on? Even if it isn't, remember, the lens is just an eye, and the eye is always open. The sync is at 99%. Don't blink. You wouldn't want to miss the moment your own life becomes a permanent playback. Sleep well, Mark. Sleep well, everyone. We'll see you in the next cut.